Renee, thank you in advance for being with us. It's just so wonderful to see you, and I know we're going to learn a lot and just enjoy this conversation. And I'm looking forward to the questions from the audience as well. So a little about you, Renee, for everyone. Renee Rosen is the best-selling author of historical fiction. Her novels include Park Avenue Summer, Windy City Blues, White Collar Girl, What the Lady Wants, and Dollface, as well as the young adult novel Every Crooked Pot. Her new novel, The Social Graces, a story about Mrs. Astor and Mrs. Vanderbilt vying for control of New York City society during the Gilded Age, will be out April 20th, 2021 from Penguin Random House, Berkeley. Renee is, a native of Akron, Ohio, and a graduate of the American University in Washington, D.C. She now lives in Chicago, where she is at work on a new novel about, I learned yesterday, Estee Lauder, which should be a wonderful read. Welcome, Renee.
Oh, thanks so much for having me. It's great.
Yeah. Renee, we read and discussed your 2014 historical novel, What the Lady Wants, at the library this past month in our fiction book group. So some of us know the novel well, but for those of our audience who've yet to read What the Lady Wants, would you mind sharing a brief synopsis?
Yeah, so What the Lady Wants is the story of Marshall Field, the retail tycoon, who had a 30-year love affair with his neighbor, Delia Katon. And they were both married to other people. And the novel opens during the Great Chicago Fire in 1871. And it goes through how he built the store and all the obstacles that he had to overcome, and goes through the Haymarket riots, the Columbian Exposition, all the way up to his death in 1906. So.
Great. The opening of the book is just so incredible with the fire. It was wonderful to kind of live that experience vicariously through your novel. So I am curious a little bit more about What the Lady Wants, and I wanted to ask you what inspired you to write about Marshall Field.
Okay, so I was thinking about this, and I had actually written my first adult novel, which was Dollface, set in Chicago. Flapper falls in love with two mobsters from rival gangs during Prohibition Chicago. And the book did well enough that my editor said, give us another Chicago historical novel. And I started thinking, well, what's more Chicago than Marshall Field? But I was thinking when I began doing some research, and this isn't a spoiler because it's out there and people know it, but Marshall Field Jr. Was supposedly shot in a brothel in the Everly Club. And this is one of Chicago's great mysteries. It's never really been solved. The family covered it up. And I initially thought that was going to be the makings of a really juicy Chicago historical novel. And I wrote up a synopsis. I was so excited. I sent it off to my editor, and she came back and she said, no, 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 no. This has to be about Marshall Sr. and the store. And this would be the first of many times that my publisher has saved me from myself, because it's the absolute right call. But again, I didn't know if there was a story there beyond just a rags to riches story. And so when I started digging and doing some research, and I found out that he had had this love affair with his neighbor, I was like, that's juicy. I can work with that. And that was sort of the start of it.
Yeah, I hope that's wonderful. You allowed yourself to make that big turn with the subject matter.
Well, they all felt so strongly about it. And it had another title. It was The Secrets of Millionaires Row was the original title. I mean, it was a whole different thing. And, everybody, from my editor to the publisher to marketing and sales, because, it takes a village, right?
Right.
They all felt so strongly that it had to be Marshall Field Sr. and the store. And they were so right about that.
Yeah, I absolutely can see why. I'm wondering if you felt that the nostalgia and people's fond memories of Marshall Field's The Department Store impacted the marketing and sales of the book.
Uh, Absolutely. And, that's when I knew almost on the first day that they were right. Because somebody told me that WGN Radio was talking about this new Marshall Field book. And then what we did is an advertising effort. We did a TV spot, and it was just a very simple spot using um, just a simple music track and a voiceover and images that were in the public domain. And we did a cable buy just in the Chicago and Chicagoland area. And people were telling me they would be in the other room and they would hear Marshall Field and they'd come running to the TV to see what it was. So, I think people have such a special place in their heart for that store and the memories. And, if we had gone with Junior's story, it just wouldn't have had the same punch. So definitely it was an asset.
Right, right. For those of you in our audience who know, the library often does a program about Christmas at Marshall Fields, and it's always very well attended and quite a wonderful thing to have that time traveling experience back to that beautiful store. It's clear once, from the first page, Renee, that you did an incredible amount of research for What the Lady Wants, both about the city of Chicago during this particular period of history, and also about the characters in the novel who, like Marshall Field and Junior, are based on real people who lived during this time, not to mention the main point of view, Delia Katon. Many of these people were prominent public figures. And I guess I'm wondering, as you tried to, learn more about them, how you went about your research for this book, and also what were the challenges of doing the research?
So I spent a great deal of time at the Newberry Library and the Chicago History Museum. And it's a really cool experience. If you haven't done a deep dive into, something like this, they give you white gloves and the boxes come out with all the old photographs. And, I saw blueprints of the original Marshall Field store, the flagship store. And, you're touching history. And there was an appointment book in there. And I'm not sure if it was Marshall Field or Selfridge's or whose, but it was talking about the different displays. So, I always start with reading, and there were a number of nonfiction books about Marshall Field. One that was Give the Lady What She Wants, by, who was it? Herman Kogan. And I asked Rick Kogan, his son, I said, can I basically bastardize the title and use it for my book? And he said, absolutely, use it. So I always start with, reading and trying to get a foundation. And then, I went to the library, and I just, in the Newberry Library, if you've never researched there, it's pretty intimidating. It's pretty, and they could not have been kinder and more helpful. And then from there, I realized that even though these were public figures, they were very private people. And just because of society at that time period, even in Delia's correspondence with her father, she wasn't going to say, I'm having an affair with Marshall Field, or, so I kind of had to read between the lines. And at the end of the day, I had to put meat on the bones because there just wasn't enough accessible there. And I tried to be as organic as I possibly could, but the real challenge was, how do you bring these people to life when the historical content just isn't available?
Yeah, absolutely. Do you remember some of the places where you saw, aha, there's a clue here and I can tease it out? And I mean, clearly you love research, which I have another question about that related to that, but it is, being a detective. It seems like that's what you were doing and trying to work out these people's stories.
You go down rabbit holes, and you never know what you're going to turn up in there.
Yeah.
Uh, and one of the things that I kept seeing Delia with this dog. Who is this dog? And I finally found out that the dog was Flossie, and it was, her traveling companion. And I also saw letters from Catherine Eddy Beveridge, who was her, who was it? It was her niece, her great, was it great? Her niece. I'm sorry, book is a couple books back.
You've done a lot of work.
But I remember reading in the correspondence that she said, I'm going with Aunt Dell to, Europe, and Mr. Field is coming with us, and Uncle Arthur seems not happy, and he's sullen now. And so that gave me some clue as to, that they traveled together and that he must have been very aware of the relationship.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I read in a 2014 Chicago Tribune interview with you about what the lady wants. This quote from Sarah Gruen, who wrote Water for Elephants, which I know many people I have, and probably in this audience appreciate and enjoy. I love that novel. And Sarah was quoted as saying, quote, "If you're dealing with real people in your fiction, it's difficult." And she says, in What the Lady Wants, Renee was dealing with Marshall Field, a very famous person. I think the challenge for her was to find the balance between storytelling and not twisting the truth too much. It's a very fine line to walk, but she walked it. So great praise from a great author. And I wonder, given that whole idea of storytelling and not twisting the truth too much, how in your process, because in Park Avenue Summer, Helen Gurley Brown comes up, right? The author of Sex and the Single Girl and the editor of Cosmos. So again, a very public figure about whom we have more record even probably than the people from the late 1800s. So I'm wondering how you determine the types of creative license you're willing to take when writing a book.
That's a great question. Each book has been different in that regard. And, in truth, I probably took more license with What the Lady Wants than I have with any of my other books. I always try to stick to the facts wherever I can. Sometimes I have to compress a timeline because otherwise I'm going to be treading water for 60 or 70 pages and nobody needs that. And, at the end of the day, I am telling a story. And, in the case of What the Lady Wants, that information simply wasn't there. And I always do an author's note in the back of my book because I feel that I owe that to the reader so that they know what fact from fiction. And, sometimes I don't outline or anything like that. I let the characters lead the way. And, I'm surprised sometimes. And sometimes I'll go back, a character does something, then I go back and I find some research that supports it. So that's always good.
Wow.
And, each book really has been different with that. And, I don't know if I sat down now to write this book that I would be as comfortable with some of the liberties that I took. Like, I don't think I would do that going forward, but I had no choice. I've also written about people and subjects that are better documented.
Right. Absolutely.
Like, there were just too many holes. And I think it was the third draft or something. My editor and I were like, what do we do? Because these people are not coming through as real people.
In What the Lady Wants, you felt that way. So much work trying to make your way through just to the final
it's like
reality of narrative reality.
Yeah. And, it's like, I'm not writing narrative nonfiction. I have a great deal of respect for people who do.
Right.
My brain is not wired that way. I just,
Right.
uh,
I mean, I so respect the notes that you put at the end of the book. And one of the things that when I got to that part and I read the notes and I thought back on the novel, I thought, this is an invitation to imagine possibilities from people from the past that we don't know about.
yeah,
And it, you know, we could stay with either our knowledge is limited by the facts and nothing but the facts, which in that case, you know, where would historical fiction be? You know, but here is an example of how to just see that world in a new way, and then move from there. Think of other possibilities as well, perhaps.
yeah. And honestly, once I got to know what was available to me about Marshall Field and Delia and the other characters, the people that I'd researched, they started coming forward and telling their story, and I kind of sit back and let them do their
Yeah,
thing.
yeah.
It's
Some,
just, I try to make it as organic as I possibly can.
yeah,
um, you know and sometimes you have no choice, because at the end of the day, you have to tell a compelling story.
right, right. Well, the characters were so rich and vivid to me that I found myself wishing, like for additional novels about some of the secondary characters who weren't quite, you know, weren't the central characters in the novel, like Delia. Um, and, so I think that's a testament to how strong they were. How hard was it for you to get into the point of view of Delia Katon, a woman from such another era? Like, how did you, fit yourself into those clothes in a sense and see the world through her eyes?
I again, when you start to do your research, I knew she was a socialite. I knew that her wedding to Arthur was sort of like a royal wedding for Chicago. She was a fashion plate. um, and she came from a wealthy family. Her father was a successful dry goods merchant. And frankly, one of the things that was trickiest for me was to understand her attraction to Marshall Field, because he was a quiet guy. He was the antithesis of Arthur. He was a man of leisure. All he wanted to do was race horses and,
Right,
raise dogs and all that.
right.
Um, and so that was tricky for me, because I kind of, I wanted to understand what she found so compelling in him.
Yeah,
And, was it the power thing? He was a successful, powerful man, but, he was incredibly frugal. And there were a lot of things about him that I did not like. And that made it a real challenge.
yeah, yeah, yeah. Well, I think that sense of, I mean, so many of your books, all of your books really focus on such strict, strong female
Mhm.
main characters. And like taking the legendary phrase, give the lady what she wants, and dropping the give and making the title What the Lady Wants, right there, kind of gives me, at least when I read that, a clue that this is going to be a woman who may be kind of in this gilded birdcage of um, that particular culture and that particular time. But she has this really strong will and a desire to, a kind of tenacious desire to act in the world and make a difference.
Yeah.
So it's what she wants, not some beneficent Marshall Fields giving it to her throughout the book, I think.
At one point I realized that Marshall Field was somebody who listened to her opinions, and that was
Yeah,
very validating for her. And so I think that was something that she must have loved about, being with him.
right. Absolutely. Absolutely. Um, Obviously, department stores and retail in general have changed dramatically since the early days of Marshall Field, and even more so recently since COVID. And I'm wondering, from the experience of writing that and looking at those blueprints and, you know, reading about the kind of garments that were being sold and the attentiveness of the people who, and the pride of the people who worked in the stores like Marshall Fields. I'm wondering what you think would have been the best part of shopping in those days. Just what was your, because some of the, for instance, the scenes in Fields and the scenes at some of the parties of these elaborate parties, these festivities, are so vivid and real in your book. It feels like you have really entered into the setting and imagined it so fully. So I'm wondering after that, what your thoughts are about the
Well,
beauty of retail back then.
well, we have to kind of put ourselves back in that mindset where women couldn't go anywhere unescorted. You know, they couldn't go to restaurants, they couldn't go to the theater by themselves. There were no tea rooms for women or anything like that. All they could do was go to the dry goods store. That was the only thing. So that was their bit of freedom. And prior to Marshall Field coming around, on Lake Street was the original main shopping drag, but it was just chaos. And there was no order. There was nobody to wait on you. Candlesticks were thrown in with fishing poles, and notions were thrown, you know, with tools. And it was every man for himself. Plus it smelled down there. It was not a place you wanted to spend time. And then all of a sudden comes this marble palace of Marshall Field, where your carriage comes up and the doorman, if you're a regular customer, he greets you by name, and you know, you can check your coat and your bags, and you could even check your children if you wanted to, because they catered to women. And you know, also in the early days of dry goods stores, there were no bathrooms and there were no restaurants. So the women shopped every day up until the point where they were going to pass out from hunger, or they just had to go. And so they
Yeah.
went home, because so just even putting a powder room or a ladies lounge in Marshall Field was just a game changer.
Mhm.
And also, you know, when the walnut room, the precursor of the walnut room, how that came about, that suddenly, you know, people could shop all day. You know, it really affected the bottom line, because these women weren't going home to eat. They could stay, eat. So I think it became a whole social event. I think it became a bit of independence and freedom. And plus, Marshall Field brought in the finest of fabrics and leather goods and imported everything. And it was a bit of that European texture that they could have for themselves.
Mhm. And what, you know, is the kind of really what had recently been a frontier city, what had recently been a swamp, to have this kind of spring up,
Yeah.
this 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 beautiful architecture, but also a whole new way of functioning, which
Yeah.
of course also nurtured, you know, capitalism. But yeah, it's mind blowing the amount of change that happened in such a short period of time.
Yeah, because Chicago is really considered a trading post.
Right.
Like, why would you go there? People would turn on their faucets, they'd find fish, you know, swimming, you know, bathtubs and all. And everybody thought, if you're going to go to Chicago, you're crazy. But these businessmen, these great visionaries, knew we had the railroads and we had the Great Lakes. Anything that was going to happen from New York to the West Coast was going to have to pass through Chicago.
Right.
And, you know, and I think Chicago always had that little, you know, a bit of a chip on its shoulder, that, you know, they weren't as glamorous or sophisticated as New York, and the East Coasters sort of looked down their nose. And so having someone like Delia, who was so fashionable, and, you know, that really sort of upped the the stakes and made Chicago seem more cosmopolitan.
Right, right. Old Second City tradition, right? And that kind of brings me to my next question, which is about the Social Graces, which is coming out in a month. A
Yes.
month and what, 2 days, I think? It's the 18th, it's coming out the 20th.
Yeah, yeah.
Whoa,
Yeah.
you're on the horizon. Um, so I was so happy to see that the novel received a starred review from Publishers Weekly. That is a big, like, industry event, when a book gets a starred review.
Thrilled.
Yeah,
So surprised and really thrilled.
yeah. So the reviewer called the novel a witty and beautifully imagined Gilded Age outing, and also said that you, quote, dig deep to reveal the humanity of these socialites, which I do think was really coming through, you know, in What the Lady Wants as well, um, as they cope with various crises. And then you say, the reviewer says, Rosen delights with breezy dialogue and keen insights into that era. Historical fans will love this. That's quite, an applause. So congratulations. But I'm really curious in terms of what you said about Chicago having a chip on its shoulder a little bit to New York. What, having written The Social Graces, when you compare it to What the Lady Wants, they're both set in the same era in the Gilded Age. And I'm wondering what your takeaway is now about what the two cities were, how they differed during that time.
So, I mean, the books are very, very different, but one thing I can say is that New York, in The Social Graces, it's really the story of two powerful women, Alva Vanderbilt and Caroline Astor, vying for control of society. And again, in that time period, women had nothing to do. They couldn't vote, they didn't work outside the home, they didn't own property. The one thing that they had was society, and that became their focal point. And so, New York was much more society focused. I think Chicago was more industrial focused.
Mm.
And in the Social Graces, it's really, the more celebrated the hostess, the more powerful the woman. And it was also the fight between the old money and the new money. You had the Knickerbockers, who were the original Dutch descendants. That was Caroline Astor. And then you had the new money, or the nouveau riche, and that was the Vanderbilts, the JP Morgans, the Carnegies. And Caroline Astor was the reigning queen of society. She wanted nothing to do with the nouveau riche. And her whole objective was to keep them out of society. She was the gatekeeper. And Alva Vanderbilt was her rival. She not only wanted in society, she actually wanted to overthrow Caroline. And so it became this sort of who can outdo each other, who can outspend, who could throw a more elaborate ball, who could host a more celebrated dinner party, who could have more gemstones in their gowns, who could have a bigger house. And a friend read it and he said, oh my God, this is like the original Real Housewives of New York, but in Worth gowns, So I think it was much more about etiquette, society, the battle between the nouveau riche and the Knickerbockers, and exclusivity. They had the 400 Club. There were 400 families that they considered in society in New York. We didn't have anything like that here in Chicago.
Wow. And in a way, I correct me if I'm wrong, but it sounds like in Chicago with Marshall Field and Delia Katon, and everyone was nouveau riche. Is that true? Or would you?
I think that, well, we certainly didn't have Knickerbockers here in Chicago.
Right.
But old money went back, I believe it was 3 generations. And, Caroline Astor would always say, I believe one's wealth should be inherited, not earned,
Wow.
Great gig if you can get it. But they did not believe in working, the men didn't work. They had their inheritances. And so, yeah, the robber barons and all that would be all new money.
Wow. I guess I really hadn't made that connection, which is really a big difference. And it feels like New York really has almost like harkens back to the old world way of, of class, you know.
Yeah, it was a real world of the haves and the have-nots,
Yeah.
and who's in and who's out. And
Yeah, absolutely. That's really interesting. Um, well, I'm looking forward to reading it. So, um, I guess I wanted to ask about another city now, which maybe had its own. I wonder if it had a version of the Gilded Age, but you grew up in Akron, Ohio, and you often visited Chicago with your mother, it
yes.
said in interviews, who loved going to Marshall Fields. And I'm wondering if when you were in the Walnut Room having lunch, or getting Frango mints, or bringing home your purchases in those green bags, if you were already dreaming of being a writer. Um, and I guess so that's another way of asking how you and when did you claim your career?
So this is really weird, but I have always known I wanted to be a writer from the time I was a little girl. And I was actually writing before I was reading, which is so backwards, and I do not recommend it. But like, no one wanted to play Barbies with me, my friends, because all they wanted to do was put on fancy clothes and have Barbie and Ken kiss, like put them together and kiss. And I was very concerned with their storylines and what was going to happen. And they can't just go off to Paris because they just had a big fight, and that really needs to be resolved. And nobody they're like, just put on the clothes and keep going. Uh, and when I was a little girl, we had a black chalkboard in our basement, and I didn't know how to write cursive yet. But all I could do was write E's and L's and M's and N's. And I would just do that over and over and over again. And I used to play on my grandfather's typewriter, and I was always writing plays or short stories or poems. So that was something I just always knew. And when I was in high school, I remember I'd set up my bedroom as an office. And I'm sort of dating myself here, but I had the whiteout, the carbon paper, the typewriter, and and I wrote a god awful novel when I was in high school. And that will forever be in the drawer.
Do you remember what it was called? Did you have a title?
It was called The Young Professionals. And that was before
Ooh,
there was a
catchy.
yuppie. There was no such thing as a yuppie back then. And
Yeah.
the first line was, I can't remember the character's name, but she suffered through the first of what would be a lifetime of restless nights to follow.
That's awesome. Oh, it's a one. Well, I hope you still have the copy you said.
I actually do, but no one will ever see it.
It's good to have, though.
Yeah.
Could you describe your writing process now? Do you write every day, or do you use a computer? Where do you write?
I do write every day, although right now, which is weird, I'm not writing because I finished the Estee Lauder book, this draft of it, so it's off with some beta readers, and so I'm giving myself some air there. So, and it does feel weird not to write because typically I write every day, 7 days a week. I do not outline. I write myself into 20,000 word corners constantly.
Hmm.
And I draft at the keyboard. And my editor will say, well, what's the story? Like, we're starting a new book, and she'll be like, what's the story? What does this character want? And it's like, I don't know yet, because I actually access the story and the characters through the physical act of tapping it out on the keyboard. I know that sounds weird, but I've just figured this out about myself. I have to write to figure out what it is I'm trying to write about. And I never know my endings. I'll know because I do some preliminary research. I know a few milestones that I have to hit, things that historically happened. But one thing that and I'm terrible at beginnings. I usually start a book. I'll write 100 pages, trash it, 200 pages, trash it. The Social Graces, I rewrote top to bottom 3 times because we could not get it right. And I find that it's trying to start a book is like starting a roll of cellophane tape. You're going around and around and around, and you just don't know where to start the book, what point of view you're going to tell. All that, all those are really crucial decisions. Even tense, is it going to be, present tense, past tense, close third, omniscient, there's so many decisions. And I guess I don't consciously think that out. I just start tapping away. And
Just to make sure I understand, when do you said you had done some research. Do you have to write to even figure out what you want to research? Or do you launch on research and then say, aha, this might be a nugget that I can work with?
I'll do some very preliminary research, and usually just enough so that I can write even just a couple paragraphs of this is what it's going to be. And we all know when I turn that in that the final book will not even resemble that. It's just what we do. And then what I've also found is that each book sort of dictates its own process of when to do the research. Like What the Lady Wants, I researched and wrote simultaneously.
Wow.
The blues book, Windy City Blues, after just beating my head against the laptop and 300 some pages trashed, I finally put down, just closed the lid, and started researching like crazy because I just didn't know enough about the blues to write that story. So each book has been a little bit different.
For the blues book, then you knew you wanted to write about the blues?
All I knew was that I was going to write a book about the blues. And for people who are familiar, it's a story of an interracial love story wrapped around the birth of Chicago blues and the birth of the civil rights movement. And I had originally started and it's got 3 narrators. And I had originally started to tell the story just from the female character's point of view. And I got about 200 pages in, and I read it, I'm like, this is a disaster. And I scrapped it. And I did about 100 and some pages. I'm like, oh, this still isn't working. On the third try, I got about 75 pages in, and I realized what the problem was. It was too big of a story to be told from one character's point of view.
Wow.
And I needed a record industry guy, so I brought in Leonard Chess. And I needed a bluesman from the Delta, so I brought in Red Dupree. And from there, the story, I did not know that Leva and Red were going to fall in love. I had no idea. I had no idea I was going to go anywhere near the civil rights movement. But the characters, that was their story. And I do think that when we're writing, that characters have a destiny to fulfill. And we just become the vehicle for that. Do you feel like that with your own work?
I at times with some characters I might. I'm trying to think. I mean, when I think about, I do have had that experience of the physical act of writing.
Yes.
It's the physical work, kind of like, the way, whether it's a farmer doing the field or, someone working out at a gym, there's something about the physical effort that, inspires material, and it generates ideas.
Yeah.
That if I just can't sit around and think, it has to come from the doing. I'm trying to think about your comment about the destiny, and I love that idea. And I do think characters, I've never used the word destiny, but I do think they have this energy that goes in a certain direction, and it can be a very surprising direction.
Yeah. And
I kind of respect it.
I used to fight it. It's like, no, I want you to go left. And the character would say, no, I'm going right. And I'd be like, no, you have to go left. And that's where I would get myself into these 20,000 word corners.
Right.
I've learned to trust if a character wants to do something, follow them. Just follow them and see where they lead you.
Right. I'm looking at the time, and I want to make sure we allow our listeners to ask questions. It looks like there might even be one in the Q&A already, but I just wonder if I was so much we could talk about this all night. I will come back with more questions if we don't have enough to go on, but from our listeners, but I hope we do. I just am wondering, do you have a few books you're reading right now that you want to toss out as things that you feel like you love? You're just passionate about.
Yeah, there's a book. It's coming out in just a couple weeks, March 30th, called The Women of Chateau Lafayette by Stephanie Dray. This book knocked my socks off. It's 3 wars, 3 women. It's a work of historical fiction that it's just a masterpiece. I can't even begin to imagine the kind of research that she did. And it goes down so easy. I couldn't put it down. I loved it.
The
Absolutely.
Women of Chateau Lafayette.
The Women of Chateau Lafayette. And it covers the American Revolution, the First World War, the Second World War, but it's not a World War II book. It's its own entity. The language is beautiful. The characters are unforgettable. I just can't say enough good things about it.
Awesome. So you read an advanced review copy.
Yeah, yeah. So keep that one on your radar.
I will, absolutely.
Another one real quick is The Invisible Woman by Erica Roebuck.
Oh.
It's a story of Virginia Hall, who was a spy she had a prosthetic leg. She was really the underdog. And again, it's not your typical World War II story. It really goes into how she became a spy. She just really brought her to life.
Do you mind repeating that title?
Yeah, The Invisible Woman by Erica Roebuck, and that's out now.
Okay.
And there's so much good stuff out there.
Oh, yeah. To be read pile is always very high. So, Courtney, I'm wondering if you're able to let us know what some of the questions are. Looks like you posted the, oh, good.
I'm here. I'm just posting Renee's book recommendations in case everybody wants, because now I want to read them.
Yeah.
So our first question came in earlier. Let's go back up. And so, by the way, now is the time to put your questions into the Q&A or the chat at the bottom of your screen for our wonderful author. So our first question, hi Renee, when you sit down to write, do you have everything outlined in your head or on paper, and do you just expand upon that, or do you add conversation as you write or later? I think you answered this already, that you don't use an outline.
Well, I will say this, in my first draft is just, it's Morse code. I would never show it to anybody. And I literally will make notes to myself, like, insert witty dialogue here, sex scene here, I mean, because I don't have the bandwidth, or I'm not as in touch with what I need for that scene at that time. So I have lots of notes to myself.
Okay, and our next question, did all married women in the 19th century or the 20th century keep their maiden names prominently featured, like a middle name, or is this only true for the high society women in major cities?
So I am not familiar with them keeping, like, Caroline, Webster, Schermerhorn, Astor. I guess she kept that. But she was really Mrs. Astor. And most of the women in my research, and maybe whoever is asking the question can elaborate on this, but most of the research that I found, like, the calling card was everything. If you were a lady of society, you had a calling card, and it was Mrs. William Kissman Vanderbilt. Mrs. Astor was originally Mrs. William Backhouse Astor. And when she saw it in print, it reminded her of an outhouse. And so then she started calling Mrs. William B. Astor. And then she just kicked William out altogether, and she was just Mrs. Astor. So, but I don't know if that answers the question, but I think that my understanding was that they used their husbands' names, not their maiden names.
Our next question, I talked to you both about this in our practice session, but we had a presentation on Tuesday about the women who helped build Chicago, in the 20th century, and the presenter had not heard of Delia Katon. Was that because she was so ostracized by her peers because of her affair with Marshall Field?
I just think she, other than being, Marshall Field's mistress for 30 years, she didn't do for the city like what Bertha Palmer did or some of the other figures. So there really wasn't anything to hitch her wagon to that, you know, because Marshall Field certainly wouldn't give her any credit for, you know, publicly for making any contributions to the store. So I think that's probably why. I don't think that she was, you know, they spent so much time in Europe because they could be together there, you know, and not be scrutinized. There may have been some people that sort of pushed her off to the sideline. But I think it's more that we can't look at, you know, a building or a foundation or something that has Delia's stamp on it. Do you know what I mean? So I think that's probably has more to do with it.
I like this next question. When writing about these real people, do you ever get feedback from their descendants, either positive or negative?
So I get crazy, stupid lucky with research. When I was writing about Helen Gurley Brown in Park Avenue Summer, I was introduced to a woman who regarded Helen Gurley Brown as her second mother. She was Mommy Helen. And she vetted the book. She shared letters and photographs. And she would say, you're starting to sound like Anna Wintour there. That was not Mommy Helen. And she gave me insight into Helen Gurley Brown that I never could have gotten from, you know, preliminary source material. And then like with Windy City Blues, we became really good friends with members of the Chess family. I remember going to lunch with Terry Chess. So it was Leonard and Phil Chess founded Chess Records, which was this huge blues label that started here in Chicago. And I remember I was having lunch with Terry Chess, and I was so nervous because I'm having lunch with like blues royalty. And I had all my questions down and everything. He was the nicest man, and we didn't get through half our questions. And then we ended up, and then John's a real music buff. He wanted to ask questions, and Terry's wife wanted to come along. Then we went for dinner, and we just became friends. So, and they really endorsed the book. Terry and I did a ton of radio interviews about just Chess Records and the history of the blues. So I get really lucky in terms of having the support of the families. In the case of What the Lady Wants, I did not contact the Field family, only because I was more focused on Delia and because none of the descendants of Marshall Field were involved with the store. So I didn't feel that they were going to be able to, although every time I went out to Lake Forest, I kind of held my breath a little bit, you know, because that's Field country. But I know that they're aware of the book, but I don't think there was anything in there that, you know, they would find fault with. So hopefully.
I think you just answered the next question was did you talk to the Katon, Spence, Censor, Field families before or after the publication?
Yeah, but I did find a book that was written about Catherine Eddie Beveridge, and I wish I had that book when I was writing it, because it did confirm a lot of the things that I had included in the book. And by then it was too late to contact the author because the book was already out. So
how long does it take you to write, you know, with all the research involved and all the drafts? How long does it typically take you to write a book?
well, okay, so Dollface, my very first book, the Every Crooked Pot, took 17 years. Dollface took 10 years. And when I got a contract for What the Lady Wants, I had to deliver that book in a year. And so I never was any more than 3 feet away from my laptop for a year. You know, that's why I was simultaneously researching and writing at the same time. It's just, and for a while I was doing a book a year. And when I came time to do the blues book, I just simply needed more time. The research was so dense. And so now I take about a year and a half, 2 years to, you know, once I get the book shaped up to the point where I can show it to my editor without like cringing, then we do several rounds back and forth. And it's usually about a year after I turn in the book. So if I take a year and a half to write it, then it takes about a year to get all the kinks out and all the marketing and everything with that.
Thank you.
Are there more questions?
I don't see any more.
Could I ask a quick question?
Absolutely.
So to keep up that schedule, it sounds like you write full time. And how many hours a day? Like, do you set a clock? Do you say, I have to generate this amount of material? Especially with all the like throwing out pages and then starting over again that you said you had done with some of the books.
So, sometimes my deadline dictates how many words I feel. I used to be a little bit more anal about it. It's like I have to do 2,000 words a day. And like with the SD book, I decided to really kind of not try and race to get so many words down, but really think about where I was going. So, I write, I'm freshest in the morning. So I will get up, make my coffee, maybe answer some emails, and then I just start writing. And I write until I kind of run dry for a bit. And then like during COVID, I've been working jigsaw puzzles like crazy and listening to audiobooks. So I'll do that. And then I feel like, okay, I can go back and write a little bit more. Sometimes doing something so mindless like folding laundry or emptying the dishwasher while I'm still thinking about the scene that I'm in will loosen it up,
Yeah.
But definitely write every day. And I go to sleep at night thinking about a particular scene. And it never fails me when I don't know how to fix something. I will ask it sounds so crazy, but I'll ask my subconscious, like, okay, you figure this out because I don't know what to do. Just make it work. And somewhere the next day, it'll click.
Kind of after sleeping on it and having REM sleep.
Yeah.
That's awesome. Wow. Well, I'm looking how we are ending in 5 minutes.
Yeah,
right?
I think, and I don't see any more questions. So I think this is a good place to stop. Renee, thank you so much for being here with us tonight. And Karen, thank you so much for interviewing Renee. It's only a fellow author and writer can do. And to our audience, thank you so much for joining us. And make sure to pick up Social Graces by Renee Rosen, coming out April 20th? Did you say?
April 20th. Yeah.
April 20th. And if you Google her, you can find her website and buy her book. So, or check it out from the library. We'll make sure to get a copy. Yeah, definitely. So thank you all for joining us tonight and have a wonderful night and stay safe and healthy, everyone.